The views and opinions expressed by the guests or hosts of this program do not necessarily reflect those of Divine Mercy Radio, Incorporated.
From the studios of Catholic 540 AM, Divine Mercy Radio, this is Meet the Priest. There are over 120 active diocesan and religious order priests in our listening area. Meet the Priest gives you the chance to learn more about these dedicated and interesting people.
Hello, fellow disciples. Welcome to Meet the Priest. I am your host, Mark Barada. St. John Vianney, the patron saint of parish priests, once said that the priesthood is the love of the heart of Jesus. This show strives to bring you closer to those men in the Diocese of Raleigh, now 100 years strong, who bring Jesus to people and people to Jesus. Today we have the honor of speaking with a remarkable man of faith who has dedicated 64 years to serving God, the Church, and his community. If the Diocese of Raleigh had a Mount Rushmore, no doubt he would be on it. Through decades of spiritual leadership, personal sacrifice, and unwavering commitment, he has touched countless lives. We're here today not only to reflect on his journey, but also to gain wisdom from his experiences and vision for the future. Pastor Emeritus of St. Mary Magdalene Catholic Church in Apex, Monsignor Donald Staib, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, Mark.
You were born in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, the home of birthplace of Little League Baseball. What would you like to share with us about your youth growing up in Williamsport?
Williamsport is a wonderful city in north central Pennsylvania. Very quiet and peaceful. Actually, Little League Baseball was invented when I was 11 years old. But I wasn't that good to make the team, and I would have only had one more year to play, so they passed me over.
And is that what prompted you to pursue a vocation to the priesthood?
No, other things. I grew up in St. Boniface Parish, and one of the traditions in the parish was seminarians went to the Pontifical College Josephinum, which is in Columbus, Ohio. And so I would see the boys, the young men, when they'd come home for vacations. Not all of them were ordained, but it was just kind of a tradition in my German parish.
What about the moment when you first felt called to the priesthood?
I think, like many people, it was there at a very early age. Not identified. I never proclaimed I wanted to do it until I was maybe in the 7th, 8th grade, and I actually went to the prep seminary at the Josephinum, and that's what others had done. So I did it along with another classmate who stayed with me there 10 years, but then he decided he had another vocation.
You were ordained on May 21st, 1961. What do you remember most about that day?
Well, one of the things is I never say that it was May 21st. It happened to be Pentecost that year. So when people ask me what date I was ordained, I say Pentecost, and then see if they can look it up and see what the date was. I've already put in my plate at the columbarium at the St. Mary Magdalene, it says Pentecost, 1961, but it was May 21st. The policy or the practice in those days with the students at the at Josephinum was that we were ordained at the seminary by the apostolic delegate, who now is called the nuncio in Washington. He would come to the seminary, and for reasons, it was usually on a Saturday, but for reasons I don't have any idea what it was that year, he had to come on a Sunday, so it was Pentecost Sunday. I always felt that was special.
How did you end up in North Carolina after ordination?
I chose it, but technically I was assigned by the nuncio, which is the way the Josephinum operated in those days. They asked me, and we were supposed to give 3 dioceses, and I was belligerent, and I only put 1 down because I wanted to come to Raleigh. And after a while, the request went back to the bishop, my bishop in Scranton. He said, okay, there were, in those days, this might sound strange, there were plenty of priests in Scranton. They really didn't need any. And as people who have been here in Raleigh for a while know that we were the most missionary state in the country. There were only 0.5% of the state that was Catholic. It was only when IBM and others started coming in the 60s that things changed, and I think now we're the third least Catholic state.
And is that what prompted you to
it did
want to come?
There were also some incidents, too. Actually, I came through the state traveling with some classmates and friends and visited and got to know it. And I met Bishop Waters when I was a seminarian, and he said, "Come here if you want to." And I said, "Well, we have to follow proper procedures." And so a couple of years later, when that happened, that's when I asked to come to North Carolina. And it was a decision made when I was something like 22 or 3 years old, and I have never regretted it. I'm so glad I did.
1961 saw you and Monsignors Jerry Lewis and John Wall all come to North Carolina. How did your relationship with those two gentlemen flourish over the years?
One of the things Bishop Waters had us seminarians do was come and stay in a town, a parish, to get to know the state. They were actually here 2 years, I think, before I was, just in the normal course of seminaries that they went to. And actually, Monsignor Wall was sent to Rome, so we didn't see him for 4 years until he came back for ordination. There were actually 3 others in our class that were ordained. Those 3 and Monsignor Lewis were ordained in St. Mary's in Goldsboro, and Monsignor Wall was ordained in Rome by the bishop who confirmed me when I was young.
You and Monsignor Wall still maintain a relationship to this day, do you not?
Yes, and also Monsignor Lewis until he died in December. We have a practice with 2 other clergy. We go out to dinner usually on Tuesday nights to different restaurants in the Raleigh area. Unfortunately, we were 5 and now we're 4.
When you first arrived, the state of North Carolina had one diocese, the Diocese of Raleigh. You served in various parishes all over the state, including Newton Grove, Kings Mountain, High Point, and Greensboro. What was it like back in those days?
Totally different. I don't know, sometimes when I see young people, they want to hear these stories of the old days, but yes, it was the whole state. I don't know how Bishop Waters did it, getting back and forth. We didn't have to because we were stationed in those, I was stationed in those towns you mentioned. Later on, I was at Notre Dame High School in Greensboro, and then I was Superintendent of Schools for a while. And for about 2 years of that job or assignment, I had to drive from Hendersonville, North Carolina, which is an hour past Asheville or so, all the way to Elizabeth City on the east. But the bishop did the same thing. We actually had 60 schools in those days. And we did not have all the interstate roads, and nothing was all built up. The first interstate road I ever saw was when I moved down here after ordination, and I saw those blue signs up above Henderson for 85. I didn't know what to do. I had never seen a blue sign interstate road before, and now, of course, the state's crisscrossed with them. So it was most different.
1972 comes around and the Diocese of Charlotte is formed. You are tasked with separating the Catholic schools in eastern North Carolina from the ones in western North Carolina. What did the Catholic school landscape look like back then?
It was quite different in those years. The biggest issue that faced any school in North Carolina was integration. When I went to Greensboro in 1963 to Notre Dame High School, we were 1/3 African-American kids because Bennett College in North Carolina, A&T, were there, and a lot of the professors sent their kids to the school. Of all the other high schools in Greensboro at that time, none were integrated. If you can believe it, while I was at Notre Dame High School, I taught mostly, but I also was the athletic director with no training and no competence. But it was my task to get games for the basketball team. And I'll always remember I called up a principal in, I can't think of the name, Ramseur, North Carolina, down by the...
Asheboro.
Down by Asheboro in the zoo. And on the phone, I said, would you play us in basketball? He said, well, I know you got some, in those days, they would say, Negro kids on your team. I said, yes, we do. He said, I'll make a deal with you. You play us segregated at my place and integrated at your place. I said, I'll get back with you. I met with the basketball team who had 3 African-American boys on the team, and they said, yes, do it. I was surprised. I don't think I would have done it if they had said no. Ironically, I saw 2 of those boys a couple months ago. They had a reunion. I couldn't get to it, but we FaceTimed, and I saw them. And one of them lives in Florida, and he's got relatives near Raleigh, and he stops to see me when he comes through. But it was an amazing experience to live through integration days, and quite painful sometimes.
What Notre Dame High School is obviously no more in Greensboro. What happened?
Money and nuns. It turned out in 1968, we had 150 students. That's not a lot for a high school. And it was just getting very difficult to support it. And it came to a crisis when the religious order that was there said they can't send all these nuns in the future. And they sort of saw the handwriting on the walls. I'll always remember the meeting where we drew that to a conclusion and realized we wouldn't be able to keep it going for that reason. The other high schools did well. They were able to get through that very difficult stage.
You were also director at Charlotte Catholic High School, and for 4 years, as you mentioned earlier, the Superintendent of Schools for the Diocese of Raleigh. To what do you attribute your passion for education?
I have no idea. There must be. I didn't have the opportunity to teach, but once I did, I loved it. I think if I could have had a choice at that time to stay in high schools longer, I would have done it. When Bishop Waters first assigned me to the school and to be ultimately superintendent, I said, Bishop, I haven't been trained for this. And he told me, get all the training you want. So I did. And I really enjoyed both teaching at any level I was at. The only kids that are difficult for me, when I was in the seminary, we were sent out to teach faith formation. And I was assigned to a bunch of kindergarten kids, maybe 6 or 8, weren't that many. But they smelled. I didn't know what I was doing. And after that, I never went into a classroom of 5-year-olds without a teacher with me. I love those kids, but they know that he doesn't know what he's doing in here. I learned to handle the high school, the middle school and the high school kids.
I would be remiss if we didn't spend a little time talking about your impressive and extensive educational background. You earned a master's degree in school administration from Fordham University in New York City, as well as a PhD in education and anthropology from UNC Chapel Hill. Anthropology is the study of humans past and present. I imagine all priests might benefit from such an education.
You're right.
How has it aided you in your ministry?
Yeah, every year the diocese usually sends out a questionnaire to priests. And one of the questions is, should we send some of our priests away for advanced studies? And for 20 years or more, I wrote, yes, anthropology. They never did. It was more of a joke. I knew it was. And I stumbled into that because at the time I was at Chapel Hill, you had to have a major and a minor. And so I chose anthropology as my minor. And right in the middle of my studies, they didn't require a minor anymore. I guess they still don't, but I didn't want to stop, but I also had to get my degree finished. So I had a couple years of anthropology in school, and most of it since then has been my own initiative.
You served in the bishop's office for 6 years as director of planning and as chancellor. And given your longevity, you have served under 4 bishops. You've mentioned Waters in particular. Why don't you take a few minutes to reflect on some of his virtues, as well as the late Bishop Gossman?
Bishop Waters was unique. There's no getting around it. He factors a good bit in a fellow named Bill Powers, who wrote a history of the diocese. And my understanding, Father Lewis told me, that there was a woman from somewhere in the Midwest, upper Midwest, Wisconsin maybe, who was striving to write his life. But I haven't heard that what's going on with that. There are 2 things he's noted for, especially. One was integration, and that story is pretty commonly known and probably can be found anywhere on the internet. And the other thing was liturgy. He had we didn't have English masses in English before Vatican II, but he did all other kind of things a little bit advanced. I believe he was the first president of the Liturgical Society in the United States. So he was noted for those things. In a way, he was a tough man to work with. He and I had some clashes on some things, and he wanted things done pretty much his way, and of course I had to do it his way. But he unexpectedly died at an early age, in his early 70s. And then Bishop Gossman followed him for almost 30 years, I guess. And I had a very good relationship with him. He had assigned me to start both St. Francis Parish in Raleigh and St. Mark Parish in Wilmington. But then he called me and said, "Come back, and I want you to come and work in the chancery instead." They were interested in planning. I had some experience in pastoral planning when I was in Charlotte working with a consultant that Bishop Begley had. And then I blame it all on Monsignor Lewis. I was in the planning office maybe 2 years, and he came and said, "I'm going to tell the bishop I want to retire, and you got to be the chancellor." And I had never seen that in my future of coming, but one of the interesting things I was doing there was living in the old orphanage, where there were 25 kids, and then it was down to about 15. And I really enjoyed being around them in the evenings and times of meals and things like that when I wasn't working. So that was one of the reasons I said yes, although I had no training at all. Well, I had some training in administration, but in those days, the chancellor sort of did everything that 7 different divisions do now.
You've also served as pastor at St. Mildred Parish in Swansboro. 1982, you were appointed pastor of Immaculate Conception Church in Durham, where you served for 14 years. You've had 2 life-changing sabbaticals over the years. Your first one was in the Philippines. How did you come to serve in the Boat People refugee camp?
In those days, we had a policy that priests could have sabbaticals of 3 months. And actually, only one other priest that I can remember had a 1-year sabbatical. But I was, ordained, that was 1982, so it'd be 21 years. And the priests for the 3-month sabbatical often went to Rome to study for 3 months. And I told Bishop Gossman, I spent my whole life until I was 47 years old or something in schools, and I don't want to go back to classes. I was having lunch one day with Good Shepherd sisters in Garner, commiserating, where am I going to do these 3 months? And one of them said they had a newsletter from their community, the Good Shepherd sisters in Manila. And they said, one of the sisters there just went up to this refugee camp that was opened in the Philippines for the boat people. And she looked at me and said, "You can speak English, or teach English, can't you?" I said, "Well, I guess I could." She picked up the phone and called Manila. And her nuns over there said, sure, send him over. I found out later they didn't what they were going to do with me. But meantime, I had followed through and found out that the International Catholic Migration Commission, which still exists, was handling the educational component in the refugee camp for the boat people, where there were 15,000 people, and they had supposed to learn English and American culture before they came here. And so I did that. It was pretty eye-opening. I had never been across the Pacific.
You've been back many times, I understand.
I can still remember sitting on that airplane coming back home, that this was an incredible experience. I'll probably never be back. And 4 years later, 1986, I was celebrating my 25th anniversary of ordination. And I thought I deserved something. So I arranged with the same people to go back for 6 weeks. And I sort of pitched hit with people. I didn't have a class of my own at that time. And I realized I could get back there and stay for just a month. And so I went back 3 more times for a total of 5 times in that camp. And basically helped them with English. And meanwhile, I spent a couple days or a week with the sisters in their various convents in the Philippines. So I traveled around there too.
And you've helped resettle more than 100 refugees in Durham, have you not?
Yes, that began when I came back from the first sabbatical. My assignment was to go to Durham. I had never been there. I walked in, and the second day I was there was a housekeeper, because there were a couple priests there, and she told me, there's a lady at the back door who wants to see you. And when I went down, the lady was in Patwald. Was unfortunately she just died about 6 months ago, and she was with a Vietnamese lady, and she said to me that this lady's name is Ha Guthrie, and she wants you to help get her family over here. And it was like there's something about the hand of God involved when I had just come back from seeing 15,000 Vietnamese people. They were the first ones I ever met. And then this came up. And so, yes, over the years in Durham, we sponsored 100 refugees. The 100th was a baby. And that baby, I had his wedding a couple of years ago and baptized his daughter. And I think in the North Carolina Catholic Magazine, they're going to have a story on refugees, and there'll be a picture of me baptizing his daughter.
Where did your affinity for the people of Southeast Asia come from? You also lived in Vietnam for a year, teaching in a seminary, among other things.
Yes. I had no affinity until that accidental lunch in Garner with the nuns. I didn't know much about Asia. In grade school in China, they just told us about Marco Polo, not much else. And so among the 100 people that I sponsored, the Vietnamese government and President Bill Clinton were getting ready to open up Vietnam for having some kind of decent relationship. And one of the ladies wanted to go over because her father was dying. And of course I wanted to go along to see what it was like. And so the American government basically said at that time, you can go to Vietnam, but if something happens, don't call on us to help you. It was simply a tremendous visit for me to see the country and live in the culture that was there. And so I went back a total of 15 times. I went to Vietnam over the years. The last time was about 8 years ago. But then I had the opportunity when I left Durham for a year-long sabbatical, and that's where I wanted to go. It took me a while to make the arrangements. I did teach in the seminary secretly. I knew the bishop from visiting him at other times. The bishop was the rector of the seminary, and he invited me to come. He said, come down 2 days a week and go up to the classroom. There'll be some students there. And I did. Only one day they caught me when I was coming in on my bicycle and said, the government's here, you can't go up there. We got to hide. So we hid for a while. But it was a marvelous experience teaching those seminarians.
Were Christians being persecuted during that time you were there?
It's hard to say yes, but they weren't free, and they really still are not totally free. They're under some supervision, and it's just in the last couple of years, actually, that the Vatican has now an official ambassador to Vietnam. They were doing under-the-table and unofficial things. One of the contrasts is that China is severe in restricting. Vietnam just says, go do what you want to do, but don't get in trouble. And they do. They don't. And they're pretty much in control of themselves. But they can't get out of line. If somebody starts protesting too much, carrying signs or anything like that, they're put in jail.
Then came the assignment from Bishop Gossman in 1997 to found a new parish in southwest Wake County. Talk about the early struggles getting it off the ground.
Yes, when I left for Vietnam, I had heard someone quoted the bishop as saying they want some schools. And I told him, if that's still available when I come back, I'd like to do it. So when I came back, I lived at St. Michael's. And we actually had some land in Cary. It took a year for us to realize Cary wasn't going to get any water out there. You can hardly have a building without water. So we had to jump to Apex. Father Bill Schmidt, who was at St. Andrew at that time, had bought land as looking ahead and forward. And so that's the land we started to build. And the assignment really was to start with a school. And so that's what we did. We built the school first. And it was filled right away. We had 8 grades plus a preschool, and the big problem always was finding enough money. But people were very generous in doing that. But Father Wall, we opened St. Michael's that same year, also St. Francis, but that's way up here in North Raleigh. But I always remember the last day I was in Vietnam that year, I got a letter, which was unusual. It was from Father Wall, written on a stationery from Holiday Inn in Tampa, Florida, asking me would I join him and Father Schmidt in building 2 schools. I had no idea what he was doing. He was always up to something. So until I couldn't communicate in those days, no phones back and forth. So when I got back, I found out what he was up to. And so I had the one in Apex, and of course he was at St. Michael's in Cary.
How did St. Mary Magdalene get its name?
One day after I was assigned there, I was waiting. We had Sunday Mass in a public school in Apex. But that didn't happen until after I was still living at St. Michael's for a while. And the bishops, I don't know why he told me this, but Bishop Gossman called him up and said, you got to have a name. And I said, well, I'd like to have some people first to figure out what to do. There were a couple of people I knew, and one person was a lady. She's here and actually lives here now. How can I forget her name? But we had lunch one day, and I was telling her I got to get a name. She took the diocesan directory and made a list of names of God, like Holy Trinity, of Jesus, Sacred Heart, and so forth, about the Blessed Mother, about women saints, and about men saints. Well, the shortest list was women saints. People can do that. I was interested in the New Testament because even now, in both dioceses, Charlotte and Raleigh, in the whole state, we do not have the 12 apostles yet for names of churches. At that time, there was getting to be considered things that they called St. Mary Magdalene, Apostle to the Apostles. And given the list that I had in that, we just kind of got on to St. Mary Magdalene. She was extremely popular in some groups of people in those days. And I went to the Holy Land once with some seminary classmates in 1977. I've been back since, but Father Wall goes a lot. And they're telling me that there's somewhere in the last maybe 10, 15 years, they were digging in Magdala, which is a fishing village on the Lake Tiberias. And, of course, every time they dig something, they find something, so they have to stop and call in the archaeology department of Israel to get permission to keep digging. But they are building a retreat center there in honor of St. Mary Magdalene. You can find a lot about that online.
One of the graduates of your school released a book of your homilies, 70 of them, late last year. As you know, it's titled Our Faith, and it was compiled by Claire Curlis. That had to be humbling.
Had to be
humbling?
It was. Claire spent 2 years doing that.
Went through 1,200 of your homilies. I've got to ask, is that customary for a priest to keep that many copies?
No, I'm part pack rat, and although I've had to downsize coming here. What happened in early 80s, and it was when I went to Immaculate Conception in Durham, I had a word processor. And I always had to write my sermons out. I couldn't type on a typewriter. It just didn't work right. But word processing is simply marvelous for writing a sermon. You can move things around. You can erase things, add things, and it doesn't do anything. So it was very easy. I got in the habit of, or compulsion of doing just 2 sides of a piece of paper typed for 10, 11, 12 minutes sermon. And so I had kept them, and Claire's father, Andy Curlis, knew it. And he actually photocopied all of them. There's some of them still exist on paper. And so she asked me for a Girl Scout project if she could do that. And I said, fine. It took her 2 years to put that whole thing together. And I think I'll always be indebted to her because it's something of me being left behind. I would never have done that.
What do you attribute your ability to relate your sermons to the faithful, especially young ones like Claire?
I stumbled into that a little bit on my own. There was a book I read way back in the 60s called The Estranged God. And the author compared religion and our faith to a lot of different things: history, fiction, movies, people's experiences, biographies. And it struck me that was important to see how the readings of the day related to real life, when they come from real life in the Gospels. And I just got in that habit. The American bishops, some years ago, wrote a pamphlet for priests on how to give sermons. And that was what I was doing, what they all recommended. I didn't know it at the time, but they give a more fuller explanation of that. That pamphlet probably came out in the 70s or 80s, and it was very helpful to me.
There is one homily in the book that parents asked you to preach every year at graduation, the train homily. Talk about that if you would.
That was a tearjerker. What happened was, from my youth, I had Lionel trains, which I added to over the years. And when I moved to Apex, there was an attic. And for the first time in my life, I could make it a big display. And so at Christmas time, I bring the younger children down to look at my trains. Meanwhile, my mother, I had to bring her down, and she had a parrot, which she got from one of my cousins who worked in Honduras. And she was allowed in those days to bring them back, and her name was Jolita. So I showed the kids the parrot also, who was very noisy and talkative. When I brought the kids in the house, they spent more time at the parrot than the trains. But also Thomas Wolfe, not the one of these contemporary times, but of North Carolina, 1930s, wrote a short story about a train he was on in Germany, and he saw people getting on and getting off. And he thought, I'm with these people for a short time. And he said, that's like life. People come into our life and they leave our life. And when I was giving that at graduation, the issue was, these kids are leaving our lives. And that's the tearjerker part of it. Parents think of that. And it was the parents, not the kids who asked me every year to give the same sermon. So I did, and Claire remembered it, and she wanted to put it in the book. It's the last one. I redid it sort of when she asked me.
There have been 6 popes since your ordination in 1961, Pentecost, starting with John the 23rd, and you actually got to meet Pope Benedict XVI in Rome in 2006. Would you share that story with our listeners?
Just as an aside, a New York Times investigative reporter has just written a book of the last 7 popes. He's not Catholic, and it's a different perspective when I'm reading it right now, and it's marvelously done. He could have used some Catholic to do a little proofreading in it, but tell me your question again.
Pope Benedict, in case you're just joining us, this is Meet the Priest. I'm your host, Mark Barata, and we're talking with Monsignor Donald Staib. We're talking about the visit
Pope.
with Pope Benedict in Rome in 2006.
Okay.
What are your memories of that?
2006, if that adds up right.
It's 45th anniversary of your seminary.
Of ordination. And my class from the Pontifical College Josephinum, we decided to take a trip to Rome. And there were 6 of us, I think. And one of them had a connection in Rome, and we got placed up in the front on the Wednesday audience that the popes do with the brides and grooms. So there we were in our suits, and the brides in their white dresses and the grooms in their tuxedos. And the Pope always made, or Pope Benedict did, he made he passed by all the brides and grooms and the others in the front row. And that's where that picture was taken. I said to him, I hope you can come visit us in North Carolina. And he said, I'd like to. But he never did.
And of course, in 2020, you received a framed announcement from Pope Francis naming you a chaplain to His Holiness with the title of Monsignor. Recall that day, if you will, as I understand the congregation was limited in numbers.
That was a couple weeks after I left. And it was right in the middle of COVID when I moved here to Springmore. And I knew Father Chris, my Cohn, my successor, others, they were trying to get me to come back for a Mass. And it took some negotiation because I was doing some other things. And I couldn't figure out, why are they so anxious to do this? And somehow I found out the bishop was going to be there. And I didn't I thought he's just going to say thank you for being 22 years as pastor of St. Mary Magdalene. But then at the end of Mass, he went up to the pulpit, and he was holding some piece of paper. And I didn't have my hearing aids in, and of course I was sitting not on the sound side of the sanctuary. But after, what is he talking about? And finally he sort of motioned me over, and then it struck me what he had done. I heard some particular word. It was a total surprise to me. I think it's just because I was so old.
What was it like? You mentioned moving to Springmore in July of 2020 during COVID. What was that move like for you?
Well, I was blessed that Bishop Burbage, and then when Bishop Zarama came, I was 85 years old. When I was 75, Bishop Burbage saw me someplace, and he said, I hope you're not retiring next year. And I said, I don't want to, if I don't have to. He said that the same thing a year later. And then he never brought it up again, and I never brought it up again. I really did not want to leave, and I knew at that age, I really didn't want to go anywhere else. We're supposed to leave after 12 years. Well, I was there 22 years. So it just was a combination of my getting old, and we were always building something out there. So they said, well, let him alone. Oh, that was Bishop Burbage's decision mostly. Some bishops do make you retire at 75. You can work, but you can't have an assignment. So I'll always be grateful for that great big exception they made for me.
What is a typical day like for you here at Springmore?
Boring. It's really just not doing a whole lot. Because of surgery and a fall, I don't drive at the moment, although I did before the fall, and I think I'll be able to maybe even next week.
And you do hold Mass here?
I have Mass here on Sundays and Wednesdays. They have Springmore has a small chapel. It seats about 25 people. About 16, 17 people come to Mass, and they're very grateful, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity to be here. It's a little strenuous. I had to get a bench put in so I could sit, because when I came here, I could stand, do everything else, but when you get to be 90, things change.
What has been the most difficult part of retirement outside of the boredom?
Well, it is difficult to be diminishing in health. Things I used to be able to do are just too much to do anymore. I had a birthday party last week. Some of my family was here from Florida, Pennsylvania, New York, and some from close by. And it was very nice to do that. The Vietnamese had a party for me the week before. So it's very nice but I miss being able to travel and see people like I used to be able to, and just go wherever I felt like it. But God is good to me. Most people don't get to be 90, so I'm very fortunate.
You alluded to your family. We haven't really talked about them much. Why don't you talk about your family?
My mother and father there were 5 of us. I'm the oldest of 5. And we all moved out of Williamsport eventually, although one sister went back there toward the end of her life. And when I was traveling, my brother had 6 children, and 5 of them moved to Denver. So he and his wife left Binghamton, New York, and went to Denver. So at least once, sometimes twice a year, I'd go out there for 4 or 5 days. And it was nice to do that. And I had the opportunity twice in my life, I always remember this, of taking a cruise on Disney to Alaska. I did that with half the family, and then another time I did it with the other half of the family. So that was wonderful. One of the things I most enjoyed that I never knew, when I was in the 5th grade, we studied American history and geography. I wanted to get to every state. At that point, I had only been in Pennsylvania. I actually did get to every state on some camping trips back and forth with some friends. And I was able to get to 121 countries and territories, and it's just marvelous to see them. I think I'm very fortunate in having that. So, but I'm not traveling anymore, so I really miss that. There are a couple places in the world I'd still like to see a lot, but have to do that from heaven if it's allowed.
What are those places?
The ones I'd like to do?
That you'd like to?
I wanted to always do the Silk Road, and that gets you through mostly Central Asia. I read a good bit about traveling. It's a very difficult trip physically to do it, even though those countries are modern. To get from one to another is a bit of a work. The one I'm most glad I did go to was to Mongolia. I went there with the 100th refugee, and we stayed there for a while and stayed in Agur, and then went down to Vietnam to visit his family. So those are one other great feat. I can't remember these years, maybe 90s or 80s. It's Father Byron and Father Closter, they're both deceased now, and I snuck into Cuba before it was allowed, and we got out alive.
What do you enjoy outside of your priestly duties? Hobbies, music, books?
I enjoy reading a lot. I'm scared to death. I have one eye that's not working right, to lose them. I just read the other day of a priest author about the end of his life. He couldn't see to read. So I hope I always have that, at least one good 1.5 eyes that I can read.
After 64 years of service, what gives you hope for the future?
We're in a period of some transition, and I don't know the ending of it. I think 100 years from now, people will see these years as things that are changing. These days, I certainly hope for peace. It's so awful. The two big wars that are going on, and there's a whole bunch of smaller wars going on, like in Sudan, and people don't know too much about some of those wars in Africa. I wish there were some way that we could find. I had such enjoyment of meeting people throughout the world and different kinds of people. I never understand why we can't get along with one another. But when you thought some peace might be coming, all of a sudden there's more war.
The church has undergone many changes in the last 6 decades. What changes stand out to you most?
Well, of course, anybody who lives through the changes of Vatican II remembers them as really big changes that took place in our lives. I was in the seminary in the 1950s. That was right before the council. The things that happened at the council were being written about and talked about, but I never expected they would happen so quickly and so soon. And of course, that's particularly about the liturgy and about even having deacons in the church. There was a huge change when it took place. So I can't predict the future. I honestly don't know. Obviously, we're in a moment right now with Pope Francis' health that will be determinative of some things, and a new pope might have different priorities, different ways of looking at things that will bring some other changes. The joy of being a pastor of a parish, like I was all by myself in Apex all those years, and seeing the same people at Mass every week was energizing for me to see that, and I wish other people could have that blessing in their lives.
What do you hope most people remember about your ministry?
The children always remember my parrot that I had. They talk about that and the trains, because Claire put that book of sermons together. I think something of that will also remain. I, as you mentioned earlier about my love of teaching, I didn't know I had that when I began, and I hope that people will remember those classes when these African American boys were here a couple of months ago at the reunion. I was sitting here thinking, I taught them in high school. They're now 72 years old, and it was kind of a remarkable. They're old like me, and I would love to be in classrooms again if it was possible. There's something very energizing to hear what the students had to say. I was only a half a generation older when I first started that than the students. And of course now they're so much smarter because of their knowledge of the internet and the availability of information that I don't know how that will transform itself.
How can the church continue to connect with younger generations today?
The way that I did, and it's not always possible, was to get to know them in the classroom as human beings by their names, what they were interested in, and interacting with them. That's the same with anybody, whatever age. People do, here I am talking about myself all this time, people do like to talk about themselves and their experiences, and you like to hear how others relate to that. What's that song from this King and I? By your children you will be taught. And I've always realized that's true. I learned as much from them as they did from me.
What advice would you give to someone discerning a vocation to the priesthood or religious life?
They have to discern. There's no doubt about it. It's something, and I think the church is doing it properly. They've actually added another year to preparation, and it's mostly for discernment of what they're about to do. They need that experience of being in in a parish. When you're all alone in a parish, things are different. Maybe they didn't do that. But people live alone a lot in their lives. So they need to know whether they will do that. It's a life that has its rewards and its sorrows. I mean, I don't like having funerals. They're sad. And the worst thing, of course, is young people's funerals, if you had them. And you realize not everybody succeeds in their life. People that you thought were happily married, all of a sudden they're not. And so there's a sadness to that. But there are also those joys that come from, I loved baptisms. At the St. Mary Magdalene Church, one of the questions I asked Bishop Burbidge if I could do is put the baptismal font in the middle of the church. So when I had baptisms at Mass, everybody was equidistant from them. And I thought that was one of the most beautiful times of life, when you're having children being baptized at a Mass with all the people around them.
The prophet Jonah is very important to you. There's a statue at the church. Tell us about the background, you and Jonah.
When I was in the seminary, let me start with one thing. In Durham, I lived with Father Roland Murphy, one of the great biblical scholars of the Old Testament. He actually wrote that great big book of commentary on my dining room table there. But when I was in the seminary, the church had gone through some difficult times with Bible scholars who some in the Vatican thought were getting ahead of themselves, and they were silenced. It's a story of the whole 20th century early about Bible scholars. Things were just opening up when I was in theology and studying the Old Testament. I still remember sitting in my room one day with a little pamphlet on Jonah, trying to figure out how are we supposed to explain this fellow getting swallowed by a fish. And I read in that little pamphlet, it's the Paulist Fathers that had it, Jonah is a parable. And all of a sudden I realized it makes sense. It's a parable like Jesus' parables. Jonah never lived. It's just a story telling about this funny fellow. And all of a sudden I realized that Jonah is the story of my life. Jesus keeps saying, or God says, go this way, and Jonah went the other way. And eventually, the story is the fish put him on land, and he finally did what the Lord said and went up to Mosul, Nineveh, which has been destroyed in the war 10, 20 years ago. But I realized that the Lord is always pushing us to go somewhere, and we're pushing backwards, going somewhere else. And so I got to like Jonah and thought it was a marvelous story to preach on. Actually, my Jonah sermon, I think, is in the book too. There are 7 points I made somehow about that book. But that's how it kind of came about. And so I just made it my personal story wherever I went. And I remember sitting in my house down in Apex trying to figure out, can I put that statue out there of Jonah? And at the time we had no bishop. And so I made the decision myself, but I didn't put him in the middle. He's off to the side. If somebody wants to put a more important person somewhere else. And on the top of the Jonah statue are 7 Bible verses, which concludes with the last one from the New Testament when Jesus says, there's a greater than Jonah here. So it just got to be something personal. And I found this lady, she had made a statue of St. Ignatius Loyola at St. Raphael Parish. And I talked to her, and she came up with the statue, and so that's what happened.
Well, before we close out this interview, any stories that we've missed that you would like to relate to our listeners?
I should find something, I guess.
I'm putting you on the spot, so don't feel obligated. But
well, we've touched on the things that meant so much to me in my life. Partly is family. I mean, I have 50 in the family. So 2 or 3 are going from that number that we went to Disney World. But the things that meant most to me were the experience in the classroom with those high school kids in Greensboro, and seeing the different cultures of the world in my travels, and especially seeing the horrors of a refugee camp, and yet being able to welcome those people as citizens to the United States. And it was a joy that my final years were able to build a parish community from scratch in Apex.
Monsignor Staib, thank you for sharing your journey, wisdom, and heart with us today. Your faithful service over these 64 years is an inspiration to us all. We are truly grateful for the legacy you've built and the light you continue to shine. That concludes another episode of Meet the Priest. I am your host, Mark Barata. Thank you for listening to Catholic 540 Divine Mercy Radio.